Good evening, everyone. Welcome. My name is Joe Davidge. I'm the Executive Director here at the Georgia Center for the Book. And on behalf of the Georgia Center for the Book, DeKalb County Public Library, and the DeKalb Library Foundation, welcome to another in our continuing series of virtual author events. We're so very pleased to have you here this evening and for spending a few moments of our time to hear this book talk. A few things before we begin our formal presentation. If you would like to ask a question after we finish our presentation this evening, you may do so by hitting the Q&A button to ask that question. You'll find the button at the top or the bottom of your screen, depending on your device. We've also enabled our live transcription for our hearing impaired patrons. You can find the CC button located at the top or the bottom of your screen, and by clicking on it, you can adjust the font size of the text that appears on your screen. We'd like to remind you that our bookseller this evening is Eagle Eye Bookshop in Decatur, Georgia. Eagle Eye Bookshop is an independent bookstore, and like so many bookstores since the pandemic began, have done so much to make sure that we continue to receive the books we so treasure and need during this time, by either mailing them to us, providing curbside pickup, or in some cases, even delivering them to our doors. We've included an ordering link to Eagle Eye Bookshop for the books this evening. And as a reminder, Andrew has signed some book plates that will be included in the book when you purchase from Eagle Eye Bookshop. So right now, I'd like to get on with our event. At age 56, an unknown wheelchair-bound writer from Virginia published a Gothic teen horror classic and became an international phenomenon. 7 years after the publication of Flowers in the Attic, she was dead, yet her name and legacy have lived on for nearly 70 subsequent books. Cleo Virginia Andrews was born on the 6th of June, 1923 in Portsmouth, Virginia. And after a youth plagued by illness that would later confine her to a wheelchair, Virginia helped to support her family after her father's death through an extremely successful career as a commercial artist, portrait painter, and fashion illustrator. Although Virginia was quite successful at that career, she sought creative release through writing, which she did in secret, and in 1972 completed her first novel, but not the novel that would make her famous. That would come a few years later. Andrew Neiderman is the author of numerous novels of suspense and terror, including Deficiency, The Baby Squad, Under Abduction, Death Time, In Double Jeopardy, The Dark, and The Devil's Advocate, which was made into a major motion picture starring Al Pacino, Keanu Reeves, and Charlize Theron. He was a high school teacher for 23 years before leaving to pursue a career as a novelist and screenwriter. He lives in Palm Springs, California with his wife, Diane, and since 1986, Mr. Neiderman has worked as a ghostwriter for the Andrews family, continuing and expanding the legacy of V.C. Andrews. He is here tonight to talk about the new biography, The Woman Beyond the Attic, and the latest V.C. Andrews novel, Becoming My Sister. So won't you all please join me to welcome this evening, Andrew Neiderman. Andrew?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Joe. I'm so glad to be able to speak to all of you in this hard times to meet anybody, but this is a great opportunity, especially now. The biography of Virginia has been out for a month, and it's doing very well all over the country and essentially all over the world. Virginia Andrews is an international name. There isn't a country with a publisher that doesn't have a V.C. Andrews novel. That's an amazing fact. We are not only in 25, 26 languages, but we are also in, as wild as it sounds, we're also in mainland China. So what we have here is the longest running author franchise in book history. By that I mean it's consistently published ever since Flowers in the Attic came out. And of course, Flowers in the Attic was the fastest selling paperback original novel in American literature when it came out. And it just seemed like this was a meteor that wasn't going to stop. When Virginia passed away, the Andrews family and the publishers, basically, and the agent, who was my agent at the time, Anita Diamant, asked me if I would finish a V.C. Andrews novel. And I got into it as with the prequel to Flowers in the Attic, which was called Garden of Shadows. Garden of Shadows has now been adapted into the first television limited series of Virginia Andrews. It's called Flowers in the Attic, The Origins, and it will air this summer on Lifetime. And it has great actors and actresses in it. The lead, and most people who read Flowers in the Attic will know, of Malcolm Foxworth. He's played by Jeremy Irons' son, Max Irons, and Olivia is played by Jemina Roper, a major television and film actor in England. We have Kelsey Grammer and Harry Hamlin coming in from the United States. And so it'll be an exciting television series. I look forward to it, as I know a lot of the fans are. Before that, we're going to start developing another V.C. Andrews series. This one is the Cutler series, beginning with Dawn, which at the time sold faster than Flowers in the Attic when it first came out. It's one of the bigger series, and we're going to have that starting production in May. So there's going to be quite a bit of V.C. Andrews coming out in film and television. Why is that? Well, last year, the end of the year, we concluded an agreement with A&E Studios, who took over the V.C. Andrews franchise. Why is this great? Well, it means that as far as we can see, as long as we can see, there's going to be V.C. Andrews novels adapted into movies and into television series. Even they're going to even go far out with them into other networks and streamers like Netflix and Hulu and Apple TV. So there are right now literally over 100 titles of V.C. Andrews books, and all of them are filled with characters and storylines that can be further developed, and that's what's going to occur from now on, thanks to this acquisition. But getting back to the biography, it was 40 years, and I thought it was time at this point that the readers and fans of the V.C. Andrews franchise knew the true things about V.C. Andrews, because there was so many misnomers and misinformation about her and her life that it was time to go to the family, gather all the personal information we could, pictures, personal letters, things that she wrote about writing, and develop the biography as it occurred, as her life occurred. She had a really interesting life, even though she was a handicapped person. She didn't get handicapped really in the sense that she was bedridden in house, lived only in a house until she was about 15 years old. She had problems, but they really developed when she was 15, and the operations began, and they did not result in her being cured of what her problems were. There's been a lot of different theories about it, but basically the book goes into the medical history and gives the exact details of what happened to her and how she handled it and how her mother handled it. I think those are interesting parts of the biography. Fans have read about Flowers in the Attic and assumed that so much of it came from her direct life. Not true. And what the book reveals, of course, is the origins of Flowers in the Attic, where she got the story idea, and how many years passed before she actually wrote the book. In terms of time, I would say we're looking at about 40 years. So this is a writer who had perseverance, and by the time she got the pages down and was able to develop the story, she was 55 years old. And although she claimed to publish things that nobody's ever seen, it was an amazing feat at this point in someone's life to be able to write and publish a book at that age. Only because one of the major reasons, of course, being that she was handicapped, and she sat at a 45-degree angle, and when she stood up, she had to stand up with crutches. So it was an amazing feat, just physically, for her to be able to produce the pages and develop the stories and go on with the books. As everyone knows, she wrote the Dollenganger series coming out of Flowers in the Attic. She wrote My Sweet Audrina, and another book, a science fiction story that was published in ebook. But other than that, she wasn't able to produce more before cancer took her life. She never revealed that to people when she was sick. She always kept her personal life as much as she could to herself. And in fact, she resented the fact that not publishers, but magazines and photographers would dote on her illness rather than on her work. And so she deliberately became evasive, and at times, very humorously, she lied about herself or exaggerated about herself just to play with these reporters. So after all of that, I thought this is a good time now, since the 40 years of Flowers in the Attic, that we should get the biography out. And with the help of the family, which consisted of her sister-in-laws and her niece and her nephew, and an aunt who was 103 at the time I was writing the book. Still alive, but her memory of Virginia's mother back in the 20s was really something golden to capture. They call her Baby Sis because she was the youngest of the sisters in Lillian and Andrew's family. So we were able to put all that together and publish it with the Simon & Schuster Gallery, and it's now basically out everywhere. And Amazon has done a big spread on it. Everybody in all the different book sales places, book sites have done big things on it. But nothing beats going to your local bookstore and picking it up. And I have sent in some signed print things to put in the book so that you could have an autographed copy of it. And I hope that if you're in that area that you'll be able to get it. There's so much about V.C. Andrews to talk about, and there's so much going on with the movies, and so much that has happened. There have been 15 straight movies of V.C. Andrews books, and as I said, there's going to be a lot more coming out. So I think at this time, I'd like to give you a chance to ask questions that you might have had or you might have now about the V.C. Andrews franchise and about the books that are coming out. The one that's out right now, Becoming My Sister, is literally out tomorrow. That's this pub date. And that book, I think you have a copy of it there too, but there she is. That takes place in Palm Springs, and it is a unique view of sibling rivalry that's going to be quite original for you. And it's almost like a mother brings up her daughters under the guise of ghosts of movie stars. So it's an exciting storyline, and I look forward to hearing more about it from people who read it. So Joe, we could open it up to any questions that people might have.
Excellent. Thank you, Andrew. And don't forget, please go ahead and type in your questions in the Q&A feature, and we'll take those in turn. So just to start us off, so you started working with the Andrews family on these series. It was 1986 with Garden of Shadows, and then you completed Fallen Hearts, which Virginia started in 1988. How did they, other than having that connection, how did they approach you? What was it like sort of stepping into Virginia's shoes to work with the Andrews family and to start this huge literary legacy?
Right, it was a daunting challenge. I had the same agent as Virginia did, so that was the beginning of it. And I was able to, when I learned that there was going to be this offer to me to do it, I got into all of Virginia Andrews' writing as detailed as I could, studied it like a a research paper. At the time, I was teaching creative writing and film study, as well as British Lit and American Lit, and I was very familiar with all the importance of style, vocabulary, settings, characterization, and I was able to apply that, what I was teaching, into the actual work that I was doing. So I was a little bit not frightened, but I realized that it was a really big task to pick up on it, because at the time, Virginia Andrews had already sold 25, 26 million copies in the world. So it wasn't that you were just taking over some author, you were taking over an international franchise. And I knew that I had to get into it with authenticity, and therefore I studied hard the books and the writing of Virginia Andrews. There wasn't much that the family could do because they weren't really involved in her writing. It was more studying what she did and understanding her characters and understanding what a V.C. Andrews story is. That's what led me to be able to do what I've done. At this point, as I said, there's over 100 titles of V.C. Andrews, and 7 were completed by her. So it gives you an idea what I had, the challenge I had, and how much I had to do, and how much I have done since those days. Yeah.
Excellent, excellent. Well, we do have a few questions coming in, so I'm going to go ahead and hop into those before I ask any more myself. And we have one from Ted, and he asks, speaking of the franchise, how do you come up with new ideas within the V.C. Andrews franchise?
Well, there's a certain, I don't want to say it's a formula, but there's a certain style to the V.C. Andrews storyline and to the characters. There's only one book that was written from a male point of view. Everything else is from a female point of view. So it's always going to start with a young girl or young woman. I think the oldest, one of the oldest is Willow, because she's college age. But most of the others are younger, either not in high school, then they're even younger than that. And basically what I used to think that we could go to the headlines and find V.C. Andrews stories. And it seems like the headlines is following the V.C. Andrews stories, because when Flowers in the Attic came out, the whole idea of a mother imprisoning her own children in an attic for 3 years and 3 months, whatever the time limit was, seemed wild. But there's been so many headlines of people being locked in basements and people locking up handcuffing their own children in cages. I mean, it just seemed that nothing was far-fetched. But the V.C. Andrews storyline is different. It's not an action-packed thing. There's a big difference between the novels I write under my name and V.C. Andrews. The novels under my name are very graphic. They have violence. The most violent thing in a V.C. Andrews novel, basically, is somebody being pushed down a stairway. That's it. I mean, there are no stabbings and slashes and stuff like that going on. It's not that kind of storyline. It's more psychological terror in that respect. Although I hate to use the word terror. When V.C. Andrews first came out, nobody knew where to put the books. In bookstores, she was put in horror, terror, general fiction. They didn't have YA yet, but they put her in juvenile selections because her characters were juvenile. Essentially, Flowers in the Attic created the YA novel. What is a YA novel? It's a book about a young person who has adult problems. And basically, that's what the V.C. Andrews novels are about. Young people who are faced with incredible challenges from their family, their own family, and their own siblings. And as long as you stay within that, you stay within the V.C. Andrews world. Another thing about the V.C. Andrews world that fans have noticed is the settings. The settings are so important to the story. It's almost as if the setting is another character. And in all the V.C. Andrews novels, like Foxworth Manor, I mean, where else could it take place but in a place like that? So settings are very important to me. And and that's why in Becoming My Sister, the setting being in this area in Palm Springs, what they call the movie colony, where movie stars lived and directors and producers. And there's this big estate there, and it's just full of movie memorabilia, places where movie stars lived and stayed and went to parties. It's just got the ambiance to develop into a world of itself. And that's what happens in a V.C. Andrews novel. The setting develops a world in of itself. You think about it, you don't really leave the attic too much in Flowers in the Attic. And in most of the V.C. Andrews novels, there isn't a great deal of jumping around from one place to another. It's that setting. It's very important. So all those things together, what helped me to move into writing the franchise, and it was successful right off the start. In the beginning, they thought maybe it'll last 10 years more, could maybe 15, but here it is, starting its 41st year. Amazing.
Well, it's very interesting too that you mentioned a little bit about the whole psychological aspect to it, and how it was sometimes misshelved and thought that it was young adult literature because of the protagonist. And until that time, most of the quote young adult literature end quote also involved male protagonists. Catcher in the Rye, A Separate Piece. But this really pushed the genre forward, and that people started looking at, this was so pre-Twilight, but here in 1979, we have, a very young teenage girl dealing with unbelievable problems. But at the same time, just as you mentioned, it's like, it's not graphic. It's very psychological. It was really, really ahead of its time. Do you think that this kind of came from the fact that, because of her disabilities and the things that she was suffering, that she was really kind of looking inward and seeing these things and then letting it come out on the page?
I think that's exactly right. The biography does develop that. There's even a point where she reveals that when she's writing the book, she has a mirror in front of her. So she's looking at herself, looking into herself, essentially, literally looking into herself. So that's what's fascinating in the biography. Some of these little tidbits about V.C. Andrews' work and her life that reveal so much about her, because nobody really knew her in person, and she avoided revealing all of herself. So it's only through the biography, through the help of the family, and my going through all these things, that I was able to develop a picture of V.C. Andrews that I think the fans are going to really appreciate, and already have, according to the feedback that I've been getting. So yeah, I think that made her internal, and in the books about internal problems. And it's interesting that, that we think of, when I first saw Twilight, my first reaction to it was V.C. Andrews with vampires, because the girl has such a issue with her family, and then you have the vampire family. So family being the center of all the crises and all the plot points is essential to V.C. Andrews, whereas it's not necessarily to other books. The family is such a big part of it. You learn about the character, but not every single person in the family like you do in the V.C. Andrews novel, because they all affect each other and have an impact. And there's also the interaction. It's not the funny thing about me trying to sell V.C. Andrews in Hollywood was I always came up against producers who didn't know it that well and only reacted to incest. So if I started to pitch a V.C. Andrews, they say, "Oh, it's about incest. We're not going to deal with incest." I said, "No, not every V.C. Andrews novel is about incest or has incest in it. It's a whole different world." And it took time, literally 30 years, before myself and a producer named Dan Angel, who was doing a lot of family work productions, we went around Hollywood and kept banging on doors and pushing until we finally broke through. And once it did, it never stopped. And I don't see how it will. It'll go way beyond, because a whole network owns it now, a studio, and they are just chafing at the bit to get it to as many of the storylines as they can. So it's going to be exciting years ahead of us. We have Becoming My Sister now. We have 2 novels coming out at the one in the beginning of the fall, Eden's Children, and then the sequel to that, Little Paula. So we already have 3 storylines ahead of us, and there's more coming.
Excellent, excellent. So we have another question, going back a little bit too. It says, as Garden of Shadows and Fallen Hearts were your first 2 V.C. Andrews books, what was the contrasting aspects of penning a villain origin story and the conclusion of Heavens?
The first part was villain's what?
A villain's origin story.
Villain's origin story. Oh, interesting. Well, it was easy to do finish the Heaven series because there was already a lot of material in the background to build on. So that was easy to do. Garden of Shadows, we had to go back into what Olivia's early life would be, and a lot of that has to be invented, because there are hints about it, but there's a lot of it that has to be invented. Once I read the Heaven series, I realized that Troy wasn't dead. It just hit me that we never saw him dead. And so that just exploded in my mind as to the possibilities. And so I was able to build up out of that and finish the series that way. So I'm not quite sure what is meant by villain origin, except maybe we see grandmother Olivia as a villain, and the origins of grandmother Olivia. In some ways, the bigger villain, not in some ways, the bigger villain in Flowers in the Attic is really the mother of the children, not Corinne, not as much the grandmother, even though the grandmother is hands-on. It's what the mother allows, or the mother originally intended, and what the mother then decides to do that makes her an even greater villain. And I think Olivia is kind of left alone in a sense at the end. That she's almost you almost sympathize with her in a way, because she's just locked up in her world, that the world she was in, and what she had done to the children. And Corinne is off in another world, and Olivia's just encased in her actions. So in some ways, she's sympathetic in that regard. Although it's hard, people who read the book to ever care about her because of what she does, terrible things that she does. By the way, in the biography, there are going to be some very interesting factual things in Virginia's life that will appear in Flowers in the Attic. There's no incest in her family line anywhere. That's something purely in her own imagination came up with. But for example, there's a horrible scene in Flowers in the Attic when the grandmother cuts off all of Kathy's hair. And there was a scene in Virginia's early life when she was playing in the street in Rochester, New York, and she fell into a newly oiled street, and her hair got just entangled in the oil, and her mother decided the only way to solve it was to cut her all the hair off. And sure enough, that appears in Flowers in the Attic. So it's interesting to see these autobiographical references, and I do a lot with showing how Virginia wrote Flowers in the Attic and what she was thinking of when she was writing it. Yeah.
We do have a good question that follows this up perfectly. And it says, do do you think how you approach V.C. Andrews' protagonists has evolved throughout the years?
Oh, yeah, I think one of the biggest challenges that I have is what would V.C. Andrews be writing about if she was alive today? You can't rewrite Flowers in the Attic constantly. Fans love it so much that they will see it. But when I approach the protagonist today, I have to look at it from the point of view of what's going on in today's world. For example, in Flowers in the Attic, the children didn't really have the ability to interact with anybody outside the attic. Today, it's almost impossible to write about a young person who doesn't have some contact through email, cell phones, some way with the outside world. If you cut them off completely from that, then you have an interesting plot premise, but you have to set it up within that world. So I think that the protagonists now have to have something to do with today's world in order to make it contemporary. You must do that. You can't write. I mean, if you're writing historical novels, that's one thing, but V.C. Andrews is not a historical novel. So what happens in today's world is going to play a big part on the interior V.C. Andrews protagonist. Absolutely. Yeah.
So it's interesting that you mentioned, the internet and email and social media, because when V.C. Andrews passed, even though it was well publicized, we didn't have the proliferation of that information that we do today. Before we started, I mentioned, when Anne Rice just recently passed, it was on Facebook and Instagram and immediately everywhere. And what's interesting is that, that in Dawn, it was included that the books were being ghostwritten, as if, we had to inform people that she was no longer writing these, that she had passed. And, as a bookseller, I remember hearing, of course, that there was this giant stack of sort of files that had plot points and outlines in it. Any truth to that? How much guidance do you still have from V.C. Andrews about where to go and what lines, plot points?
Oh, you mean in terms of actual notes and?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
No, there's really not anything much in that regard. She wasn't the kind of writer who outlined her books and then left the outlines all over the place. It wasn't that kind of work. She was more like, in a sense, like I am, an organic writer, which means that everything that happens from something preceding it. So the reason why that's exciting for me, I think for any writer, is when you come to the page to start a new page or to keep going, you don't know yet yourself where it's going. The characters are going to tell you. So, well, how can that be? Well, the most important thing I always tell would-be writers is the character. Character makes the story. If you develop a character, really develop it well, develop her or him well, they will make the decisions that they should make. And that is, that's in a sense the difference between life and fiction. How many times have we seen terrible things on television? Like somebody who broke out and shot 1 million people or did some terrible thing to somebody. And they go to a neighbor and they ask the neighbor, what can you tell us about Joe D? Why did he do this? Not you, but Joe D. And the neighbors usually say, I never knew it. Or this is so out of character. I can't even begin to understand. And if you do that in a novel, it won't work. Nobody's going to accept it. If you have a character you develop and who's meek and all of a sudden, out of nowhere, the character starts becoming an aggressive character, just turn the page and it's an aggressive character, people are not going to accept that. You have to build that. So you have to And where do you build it from? You've created a character, and that character now is born, and that character will now tell you what he or she will do when you confront the character with situations that you could invent or come up with. Like, how does the character react to it? And I think people listening could ask themselves the same question, you know, if I'm confronted with something, how do I react to it? Would I be different from the way I am right now? What would be the difference? You know, you have to give some justification.
Well, and, you know, I mean, I find it absolutely amazing as well that, you know, not only have you continued the V.C. Andrews franchise for all these years, but since you started working on the franchise, you have 35 plus or minus books of your own. I mean, that's just absolutely
46.
stunning.
46 Neiderman thrillers.
Wow. Amazing, amazing. That's just unbelievable. We did have a follow-up to the Olivia question. Ted says he completely agrees. I definitely found Olivia more sympathetic. He said, I was referring to Olivia was more like a Joker type of character due to the way she was treated. She was a victim of the story in her own way.
Yeah, and of course, in the beginning, Corinne doesn't really tell the children what her mother's like. You know, she just blames everything on her family, you know, cutting her out of the will and all. And we don't know the background of Corinne that much, and we learn it as we go through the book. That's what makes Corinne a character, a great character too. But I wrote 3 novels out of the Flowers in the Attic series about Corinne, Beneath the Attic being #1. And it's really Corinne's story. And how did she start? How did she get into this? And I think that's really important for the readers to keep thinking about how do these characters get to be the way they are. And that's exciting for the writer to do.
So I have a question from Marina, and this goes back to the franchise itself. And she says, in the 1980s, there was a run of mail order posters available with some of the classic V.C. Andrews book art. Is there any chance there would be a reprinting of these made available for sale to fans, or any other merchandising now that the Garden of Shadows series is upcoming?
I think there's a good chance of that because A&E Studios and Networks is interested in merchandising. And that is one of the things we have discussed. Now, the interesting thing about the early book covers, about the early ones especially, is they were artistically created. There's somebody, in other words, who has ownership, copyright, and that person has to be either paid or given permission to reprint what she created. And there was one artist that created a number of the early V.C. Andrews books. One of the things about the V.C. Andrews books that they did early on, and it's in the biography, it's a discussion of it, was what we call the step back cover. That was because of the hole in the middle, and you look through it and there was another cover inside. And that was very V.C. Andrews. In fact, when another publisher tried to do it, Simon chose to sue them because they have the copyright on that whole thing. And they backed out, the other publisher, and it remained the V.C. Andrews franchise. But what's the problem with that is today is it's extremely expensive for the publishers. So they started to fade it back because of the cost of everything. They didn't want to raise the price of the mass market so fast, and so there was that step back from the step back. But the covers are still really important, and I think that exactly what your questioner asked will happen. There will be merchandising with posters.
Yeah, I kind of remember as a former bookseller, that was always kind of the big reveal when a V.C. Andrews book came out, that, you know, everybody would see the cover and then flip the cover to see the step back picture inside and what it revealed.
That's right.
And I actually,
as I said, that biography has a whole almost a chapter on that because it was so important.
Yeah, and I vaguely remember when the sort of chapbooks came out for the Logan series, there was a run of maybe it was 11 by 14 slick posters that we gave out. You know, we may have had like 100 per store or 50 per store. And you know, not only would people clamor for those, but you know, God forbid that you would roll it or an edge would become dinged. And then it would just be, I had to have a perfect one. I had to have a perfect one. But it truly was an amazing marketing point, really, for those. And you know, almost was kind of like the Chip Kid cover designs. It just revolutionized really the selling of the mass market, honestly.
It did. And it became so well known worldwide. I mean, it was just, it was a brilliant decision by the production people at Simon Schuster. It really was. They get a lot of credit for that. And as I say, because the covers are still really important, there's always that famous saying, you know, don't judge a book by its cover. But you walk into a store and a cover will grab you. It's so important that that happens. I always try to make sure that the cover has, the people who ever do the cover know what's in the book, because there's a tendency to get, you know, some quick lines from the editor and then make a cover out of it. Well, you got to get a little deeper in the book to make sure your cover reflects the storyline. You know, like in Becoming My Sister, this, you can see that there's an estate back here, and it's so important to this, to what happens in the story, and how these two girls kind of become each other. It's really was a lot of fun writing that book.
So just a reminder to everyone, as we're approaching the top of the hour, if you have any more questions, please feel free to drop them in the Q&A. And also, don't forget, in the chat, we have the ordering links for Eagle Eye Bookshop, for the Woman Beyond the Attic, and Becoming My Sister. And we do have book plates for those that will be included whenever you purchase those books from Eagle Eye. So we have a question from Josh, and you kind of alluded to it earlier, but you know, always good to have it expanded upon. Will there be new V.C. Andrews titles even 50 years from now?
50 years? Who knows where, will there be a world 50 years from now, the way it's going? When, you know, it's hard to say. I mean, I think when VC was really very ill, the same question came up. You know, will there be another VC Andrews series? Can it go on somehow? It's so favored in the book market. In my estimation, it probably will for a while. I don't know if I can say 50 years, but it's, you know, the thing about V.C. Andrews is she created a genre on her own. In other words, it isn't horror, it isn't terror, it isn't romance. It has so many aspects of all these things in it, except for horror mainly, because the way she wrote. And that's why I said earlier that Flowers in the Attic really created the YA genre. I mean, it was, and now she even says in the biography, there's a quote by her where she says, "I'm my own genre. Don't try to pinpoint me, stick me on a shelf in one place or another. Just have an area that says V.C. Andrews. That's what the books are." And I think that's what the books are today too. Just for your viewers and listeners, knowledge, the good definition of horror and terror is that horror relates to supernatural, and terror relates to real things in life that become frightening. And that's what V.C. Andrews really concentrated on, the real things in family life that became frightening. And this is kind of what happens in all the books. And I think it never ends because families they're just full of volumes of stories. And that's why I think these years could go on for quite a long time, as long as there are families.
Well, and and reading the biography and then diving into some of the articles and everything that was written about her, um, she had this great career late in life, and she came at it with a very um, logical, very realistic view of it. And she says that she's not reading what the critics think, because critics were failed writers, and she had a very honest stance that we would want debut writers, new writers, people who are thinking about writing. It's like you have to be true to your own art, and she was very unapologetic about it. But she seemed so very well grounded in not only her own self, but the belief in her art as well.
Well, I always tell when I speak before groups of people who want to be writers, or even even in a general setting, I always say that to me, your success is 60% perseverance and 40% talent. And they say, what do you mean? I said, well, anybody that's in the arts, whether it's in acting or writing or dancing or whatever, singing, you're going to be rejected many, many, many times. You're going to be disappointed many times. And if you keep coming and you'll find success, it's because you had the perseverance. If you get disgusted and say, well, I'm not going to write anymore, or I'm not going to dance anymore, my answer to that is you probably shouldn't. If you can give it up, you shouldn't do it. And Virginia Andrews was a great personification of that. She did not give up. And who ever thought somebody at the age of 55 would persevere? One day she's 55, a handicapped person, dominated by her mother, who's always watching over her. And the next day she becomes the biggest selling writer in America, and known all over the world, wanted everywhere. It just startling. But the fact that she could handle success as well as she can handle failure is to her great thing about her. And to tell you the truth, and everybody who's listening, when I wrote the biography, I really got to know Virginia Andrews. And if you buy it and read it, if you get it, if you go to a library, whatever you get it, you will see what I mean. You will, by the time you close the pages, you will really understand who Virginia Andrews was and what it was to be a writer back then, what it is today. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Andrew. It was truly an enjoyable read. As someone who grew up as a bookseller, selling V.C. Andrews books at, well, they're closed now. I can say Borders Walden Books at Borders Walden Books,
Right.
And really never knowing, the full story of V.C. Andrews. It's such a great thing to finally have it, and to really see it from someone who knew the family, worked with the family, and continues to do so. Thank you all so much for joining us. Don't forget to pick up The Woman View on the Attic, and of course, Becoming My Sister as well. Andrew, we look forward to more V.C. Andrews books, at least for the next 50 years. You have work to do.
Okay.
Thank you all so much for coming and allowing us to come into your homes this evening. We will see you all again very, very soon. Have a wonderful night.
Thank you. Bye-bye.